Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
Ever walk into your own house and feel like a stranger who forgot to knock? That used to be me, standing in the middle of a kitchen I designed, in a house I helped pay for, listening to people laugh from the living room couch like I was a ghost, just passing through. There was no fight, no screaming match, no explosive betrayal like in the movies. Just silence. Just the slow, steady erosion of being seen, felt, wanted. And the moment that finally snapped the last thread? It came wrapped in a smile and served up as something almost reasonable. They told me I wasn't invited because, and I quote, "Well, you're always so busy anyway." That was it. No apology. No real explanation. Just a shrug of the shoulders and a justification that sounded like a compliment if you didn't listen too closely. But I was listening. I'd been listening for years. I just didn't want to hear it. It started with my stepdaughter, Anna. Her birthday came and went with the usual barrage of social media photos, filtered selfies, and balloons in the background of group shots I wasn't part of. At first, I figured maybe it was just something low-key with her friends, some girls' night out thing. But when I asked Mark, my husband of 16 years, what they ended up doing for her birthday, he said it like he'd been waiting for the question. Not nervous. Not guilty. Just casual. "Oh, we did something small at Brian's place. You know, nothing fancy." My brain hung on that we. I looked at him, trying not to jump to conclusions, but already feeling the stomach drop start. "You were there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, even though I knew the answer. He nodded, scrolling through his phone, not even looking up. "Yeah, Anna wanted to do something quick, last minute. You were working late all week. I didn't think you'd want to rush." I didn't say anything for a second. Then I asked, why didn't anyone even tell me? That's when he said it. That line that still echoes in my chest like someone shut a door and walked away. "Well, you're always so busy anyway." I didn't respond. Not right away. I stood there, nodding like a bobblehead while my chest burned. Because that wasn't the first time something like this had happened. It wasn't even the fifth. Over the last few years, I'd noticed the shift. It was like watching furniture get rearranged slowly, so slowly that you don't even realize your favorite chair's gone until one day you try to sit and fall on the floor. They used to include me. Family game nights, holidays, even stupid things like grocery trips. But then the invitations started coming later, if at all. The group texts grew quieter. Inside jokes I didn't understand started flying at the dinner table. Once, I even found out Anna had gotten engaged from Facebook. When I confronted her, she said she thought Mark had told me. And Mark? He just laughed and said it must have slipped his mind. I convinced myself I was imagining it. That I was just tired or hormonal or maybe I had been working too much. I doubled down, rearranged meetings, canceled plans, started cooking more, sitting in the living room with them instead of hiding in the office. And they didn't push me away, not directly. That's the thing, it wasn't some big rebellion. They just let me fade, like a background track they stopped noticing. After Mark said that line, I stood in the kitchen, letting the weight of it settle, and I realized I had been living on crumbs, emotional crumbs, for years. I had convinced myself that if I just showed up more, loved harder, made things easier, they'd notice. But they didn't. And I didn't have the energy to keep begging to be invited into rooms I helped build. That night, after dinner, chicken and rice, his favorite, cooked by me, served by me, eaten without a word of thanks, I went upstairs and opened my calendar. My week was full, like always. Work meetings, dentist appointment, a Zoom call with an old friend, therapy. All of it scheduled, color-coded, part of the never-ending machinery that made everything in our lives function. I stared at it, this beautiful, overbooked schedule I'd crafted to keep myself relevant, and I started deleting. One by one. Meeting with HR, gone. Grocery planning app, closed. Pilates, canceled. The call with my friend was the only one I kept, but I moved it to Sunday. Just in case. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I didn't cry. I didn't scream or slam doors or call anyone to vent. I just cleared space. And for the first time in years, I asked myself not what I needed to do, but what I needed to feel. The next morning, I made pancakes and coffee like nothing happened. Mark came down in his usual morning days, kissed the top of my head, and thanked me for breakfast, the way someone thanks a hotel staff member before checking out. I smiled back. I asked how Anna's doing. He said she's fine, planning the wedding, nervous about money. I nodded. I poured his coffee. And the whole time, I knew exactly what I was doing. I was freeing my schedule. Permanently. From them. They just hadn't noticed yet. And that somehow made it so much easier. It's a strange kind of ache, the one that settles in your chest when you're surrounded by people who talk and laugh and move around you as if you're nothing more than an object taking up space. Like a chair or a lamp that's been sitting in the same spot for too long and no one notices anymore. Not because they hate it, but because it's simply there, expected, unimpressive, easy to ignore. That was me, standing at the stove one Saturday evening, stirring a pot of chili I'd made a dozen times before, listening to Mark and Brian laugh over a video on his phone in the living room, while not a single one of them thought to ask me what I was doing, or if I wanted to join them, or even if I was okay. It wasn't cruelty in the obvious sense. They weren't shouting at me. They weren't shutting doors in my face. But there's something much colder about being forgotten while still present. About being invisible in your own kitchen with your hands deep in the labor of keeping people full who don't even see you doing it. I had hoped, in some small, naive corner of my mind, that after that first week, the week I cleared my calendar, the week I gave myself time to simply observe without trying to fix anything, maybe things would shift. Maybe someone would notice I was showing up more intentionally, or maybe Mark would sense something had shifted in me and actually bother to ask what was going on. But nothing changed. No one noticed. No one even glanced in my direction long enough to see that something in my posture had gone still. Something in my eyes had gone quiet in a way that used to worry him, back in the early years when he still gave a damn whether I was okay. I decided, almost without realizing it, that I would give them one last opportunity. Not a confrontation, not a meltdown, just one final, deliberate chance to step toward me instead of away from me. I picked a date, the coming Sunday. I planned a small backyard cookout, just for us, something simple and familiar, the kind of thing we used to do all the time back when we all still acted like family. I texted Mark, then texted both Brian and Anna, inviting them all to come by around 4. I even bought special seasoning for the burgers, the kind Brian always used to ask for when he was in college, and I made Anna's favorite potato salad the night before, letting it chill just the way she liked. I set the table out back with fresh flowers. I even put on the blue sundress Mark once said made me look like summer, even though I hadn't worn it in over 5 years. I didn't tell them this was a test, but it was. I just didn't know it was going to be the test, the final, silent confirmation of everything I'd suspected. 4 o'clock came. Then 4:15. I flipped the burgers, trying to keep my hands steady. At 4:30, Mark called. I picked up, expecting traffic or some delay. Instead, I heard his usual calm voice say, "Hey babe, we're not going to make it. Brian got concert tickets for tonight and Anna's already with him. Totally forgot it was today, sorry, we'll do it another time, okay?" Another time. Like I had an endless supply of those. Like I hadn't carved this one out with surgical precision to see if they'd choose me. I didn't respond at first, I let the silence speak. Then I said, as gently as I could muster, "Sure. Another time." And I hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I took the burgers off the grill, placed them neatly in Tupperware, covered the salads, washed the utensils, and put everything back in the fridge. The backyard looked beautiful, the golden evening light washing over the table like a staged photo from a magazine. And I just stood there, watching the wind move the napkins, thinking to myself, this is what it feels like to stop trying. That night, after cleaning up the evidence of what could have been a perfect meal, I opened the hallway closet and pulled out my old gray suitcase, the one I hadn't touched since my last solo business trip almost 3 years ago. I opened it quietly, laying it on the bed, then began sorting through my dresser. I didn't pack emotionally, I packed methodically. 3 pairs of jeans, 2 sweaters, comfortable walking shoes, my backup laptop, a folder with our joint bank information, the deed to the house, my passport. Not rushed. Not angry. Just precise. Focused. Like someone checking items off a list that had been written a long time ago. Over the next few days, I began building my quiet exit like a blueprint. I opened a new checking account in my maiden name. I rented a small furnished apartment across town, cash deposit up front, month-to-month lease. I set up a new email, changed my cloud password, forwarded my mail to a private P.O. box. At night, I sat in the living room with Mark watching some forgettable show, nodding at his occasional comments, acting like everything was fine. I cooked. I cleaned. I did the laundry. And all the while, my suitcase sat in the back of the closet, half full and waiting. I was erasing myself from the inside out, and nobody noticed. And just to be sure, to really test how far gone I was, I left for an entire day. I left my phone on the nightstand, took the car, and drove to the coast. I walked on the beach. I ate lunch alone at a seafood shack. I sat on a bench and read a book until sunset. I came home late, close to midnight. When I walked in, the lights were off, the dishwasher was running, and Mark was asleep on the couch with the TV flickering blue light over his face. There were no missed calls. No texts. No notes asking where I'd been. The next morning, I poured him coffee like I always did, and he said, "Morning," without looking up. Just like always. And that's when I knew. Not only could I leave, I already had. There's a very specific kind of calm that comes over a person when they finally stop waiting to be chosen, a stillness that replaces the anxiety, the guessing, the pleading, the exhausting mental gymnastics of trying to interpret silences and half-hearted gestures as something meaningful. It's the calm of a person who has made a decision so absolute that there's nothing left to argue about, no more votes to count, no final chances to extend. That was the calm that settled into my bones as I stood in the middle of our bedroom, a room once filled with warm light and quiet laughter, but now sterile and functional, like a hotel room we both happened to occupy, neither of us sure why we were still there. The closet door creaked open on hinges that hadn't been oiled in years, and I took it as a sign. I reached in, pulled out my suitcase, and placed it on the bed like I was preparing a patient for surgery. I packed deliberately, not emotionally, folding clothes not with the trembling hands of a woman in crisis, but with the clinical precision of someone who knows exactly how much space a pair of jeans takes, how to roll a blouse to minimize wrinkles, how to layer shoes at the bottom without crushing anything delicate. Every item that went into the suitcase had a reason, a purpose, a destination. I wasn't running, I was moving. And the difference between those two things is everything. I had spent the past week preparing every piece of the vanishing plan in silence, like a spy assembling an escape route. During the day, I played the role of the attentive wife, still showing up in the kitchen with fresh coffee, still doing the grocery runs, still smiling politely when Mark shared something mildly amusing from his phone. But behind that facade, I was dismantling my presence one thread at a time, closing accounts, transferring small amounts of money into a separate bank under my maiden name, setting up a forwarding service for my mail, and locating a short-term rental I could pay for in cash with no questions asked. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't cinematic. It was just quiet, necessary logistics, the architecture of an ending I had no intention of announcing. The apartment I found was nothing special, a one-bedroom in an aging building on the edge of town, where the neighbors mostly kept to themselves and the management didn't ask for more than a signature and first month's rent. The carpets were thin, the walls off-white and slightly scuffed, and the kitchen barely big enough to turn around in, but when I turned the key and walked in for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, ownership of my own silence. No one was there to talk over me. No one rolled their eyes or changed the subject. It was just me, my breath, and the clean hum of empty space. I spent the next 2 days furnishing it with just enough to function, a mattress on the floor, a folding table, a lamp I picked up at a thrift store, and a coffee pot, because if I was going to rebuild my life from scratch, I was at least going to start with decent coffee. I brought in a few personal things, not pictures, not mementos, nothing sentimental. Just a book, a notepad, a scarf I liked wearing in the fall. It wasn't a home, not yet, but it was the kind of place that gave me permission to imagine one. Back at the house, the performance continued. I cooked. I cleaned. I kept up appearances with a kind of hollow enthusiasm that neither Mark nor the kids seemed to question. If anything, they seemed relieved by my silence, as if the absence of tension was all they ever wanted, never mind the cost. Brian came by once with some tools he borrowed months ago, stayed for a beer, didn't ask me a single question about my life. Anna texted Mark about wedding venues, never once including me in the discussion, despite the fact that I had practically raised her since she was 11. And Mark? Mark was as predictable as ever, kind in the ways that required no effort, detached in the ways that mattered most. The night I left, there was no storm, no slam door, no shouting match. I made dinner like usual, salmon with lemon and dill, his favorite, and we sat at the table, eating in silence except for the occasional comment about work or a neighbor's new car. Afterward, I washed the dishes, wiped the counters, and packed the last few items into my purse, wallet, keys, a copy of the marriage certificate, just in case. I left the fridge full, the laundry folded, the bills paid. I didn't leave a note. I didn't leave a trace. I simply walked out the door at 9:30 in the evening while Mark was brushing his teeth, humming to himself like a man who had no idea his life had already changed. The air outside was heavy with late summer heat, and as I backed the car out of the driveway, I looked at the house one last time, not with sorrow, but with the cold clarity of someone waking up from a long, confusing dream. The porch light flickered. The living room window glowed faintly behind the curtains. And inside that familiar frame, a man stood rinsing his face in a bathroom I once painted while humming to the radio, not knowing that the woman who had done that, the woman who had spent over a decade trying to belong to a family that only ever tolerated her presence, was gone. The drive to the apartment was quiet, the city lights trailing past the windshield like a silent farewell. I arrived around 10:15, locked the door behind me, and stood in the middle of the small, dim room, letting the silence fill my ears like a warm tide. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I didn't feel triumphant or broken. I just felt done. And in that strange, weightless stillness, I finally understood something that had taken me far too long to grasp. Leaving isn't always about rage or heartbreak or screaming matches in the rain. Sometimes, it's about knowing that nothing you say will matter, so you stop speaking altogether. You stop asking to be seen. You stop knocking on a door that someone locked a long time ago. And you walk away. Quietly. Completely. Without a single trace. The first thing you notice, once you leave without a sound and no one knows you've gone, is the sharp, almost surreal quiet that follows, not just the silence of the room you now live in, but the mental silence. The emotional hush that settles in your body like snowfall after a storm, where everything is suddenly still, and the chaos you were once wrapped in fades into something distant, almost abstract, like a life you dreamed rather than lived. I didn't expect the quiet to feel like peace at first. I thought it would feel like guilt or shame or fear, but none of that arrived. Instead, I found myself sitting in that small, beige apartment with a cup of coffee that tasted like freedom. Watching the sun creep across the floor and realizing, for the first time in years, that I could simply exist without being needed, judged, or ignored. Of course, the panic didn't set in for them right away. I expected it might take an hour, maybe two. Perhaps Mark would open the bedroom door, glance at the empty closet, and immediately call, thinking I had gone to the store or out for a walk. But it wasn't like that. That night came and went without so much as a message. The next morning, I turned my old phone back on just to see if anyone had noticed the void I left behind, and what I found wasn't concern or urgency, it was nothing. Just a group message about Brian's new car, a forwarded email about a doctor's appointment I'd already rescheduled, and Mark's usual dry, heading into work, text, sent automatically at 7:15, as if I were still there making his breakfast. As if nothing had changed, as if I had never left at all. It wasn't until the end of that second day that something shifted. Around 10 in the evening, my phone vibrated with a missed call from Mark. Then another. Followed by a text, "Hey, where are you? Didn't see you last night or this morning. Everything okay?" I read the message once, then again, and laughed, not out of cruelty, but out of the sheer absurdity of a man noticing his wife was gone nearly 2 full days after she left. I didn't respond. I turned the phone back off and slid it into the drawer beside the bed, where it joined the growing list of things I no longer owed anyone. The following morning brought more missed calls, some from numbers I didn't recognize, likely mutual friends or coworkers he had roped into the search, and then the voicemails started. The first few were polite, almost casual, like someone trying not to overreact. "Hey Julie, just checking in. Give me a call when you can." Then came the confused ones. "I'm starting to get a little worried. Can you let me know you're okay?" And eventually, the guilt-laced ones, the ones where his voice cracked slightly, where I could hear the edges of panic beginning to form. "Julie, I don't know what's going on, but if this is about something I did or didn't do, just talk to me. Please. I'm really scared now." By the end of the week, the tone had shifted completely. Mark had gone from calm to concerned to desperate, and his messages began to pile up with increasing urgency. He reached out to my sister, who, bless her, had already been briefed and was playing her role perfectly, offering vague comments like, "Julie's safe, she just needs space," and refusing to elaborate further. He contacted the police at one point, I later found out, but since I was an adult and there was no evidence of danger, they simply filed a welfare report and let it go. Anna, of course, left a voicemail dripping with performance, saying she hoped I was okay, but also subtly suggesting that my disappearance was kind of dramatic, which only confirmed for me how little she had ever understood or cared about what I'd been carrying all those years. I watched it all unfold from my borrowed life, sitting in that sparse apartment that had become my sanctuary, sipping tea in the morning and taking long, aimless walks in the afternoon, marveling at how quickly people panic when the person they take for granted is no longer available to absorb their messes or play the role they've written for her. I was no longer the maid, the buffer, the emotional punching bag cloaked in polite smiles and dinner recipes. I was gone. And for the first time, they were beginning to realize what that meant. One night, maybe 10 days after I'd left, I drove by the old house, more out of curiosity than longing. I parked down the street where I couldn't be seen, kept the engine running, and just watched. The lights were on. Mark was in the living room, pacing and talking on the phone, looking 10 years older than when I last saw him. Anna was there too, curled up on the couch, scrolling through her phone with a scowl on her face like a teenager who just found out her favorite show was canceled. Brian stood in the kitchen, leaning on the counter, saying something I couldn't hear. None of them looked sad. They looked irritated, inconvenienced, like I had caused them a problem they didn't know how to solve. And that's when I knew they didn't miss me, the person, the woman, the individual with dreams and desires and a voice. They missed the function I served. They missed the comfort of a clean house, the presence of an emotional sponge, the assurance that someone would always be there to hold the mess together when things got uncomfortable. And now that I was gone, not angrily or loudly, but with complete silence, they were left with nothing but each other and the uncomfortable reality that I had carried more than they ever realized. The next morning, I met with a lawyer. She was young but sharp, direct without being cruel, and she didn't flinch when I handed her the manila envelope with my documents and said I wanted to begin the process of a divorce. I wasn't asking for revenge or retribution. I just wanted distance. Finality. A clean break. We discussed property, finances, accounts. I had done my homework, and she respected that. By the time I left her office, the paperwork was already in motion. Back at the apartment, I made myself a simple dinner and sat at the tiny table with the window cracked open, letting the late summer breeze carry in the hum of the city. I still hadn't answered any of Mark's calls, nor did I intend to. I wasn't playing a game, wasn't trying to hurt him. I was just finally, quietly, doing what I should have done a long time ago, protecting myself from people who only valued me when I was convenient. And while they scrambled to make sense of my absence, to plug the hole I left behind, I sat alone in the soft glow of a room I chose, in a life I built without apology, without explanation, without asking for permission. I wasn't lost. I had finally been found by myself. There's something peculiar about the finality of silence when it isn't accidental or circumstantial, but rather chosen, when it no longer comes from not knowing what to say, but from no longer needing to explain anything to people who, for years, pretended they were listening while, in truth, they were only waiting for their turn to speak. That's the kind of silence I found myself dwelling in during those last few weeks in the apartment, not the kind that howls with loneliness or echoes with regret, but a deep, affirming kind of quiet that let me hear my own voice again. A voice I didn't even realize I had buried beneath 16 years of polite compromises, carefully worded texts, and all those long, drawn-out dinners where I pretended everything was fine just to keep the peace. By then, the calls from Mark had slowed to a trickle. After the first 2 weeks of frantic voicemails and half-baked apologies, there was a shift, as if his energy had collapsed under the weight of not getting a response, and suddenly the urgency in his messages gave way to confusion, then blame, and finally to resignation. His last voicemail was left on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I remember it because I was reading by the window, a soft jazz record playing in the background, and I didn't even flinch when my phone lit up across the room. I let it go to voicemail, like I had every time before, and waited until the music ended before checking it. His voice was quieter this time, no dramatic pleading or manipulative guilt-tripping, just a tired, hollow man saying words that felt like they belonged to someone who still hadn't understood the lesson. "Julie, I'm not even sure if you're getting these, or if you care anymore. But if you do, just know I didn't mean for things to end up like this. I thought we were okay. I really did. And if I hurt you somehow, well, you should have said something." I listened to that line twice. You should have said something, and I laughed. Not loudly, not bitterly, just a dry, amused sound that came from the deepest part of me, the part that had spent more than a decade saying everything over and over, in 100 different ways, only to be met with nods, shrugs, or that God-forsaken phrase, "You're overthinking it." I had said plenty. I had said so much that I had run out of new ways to say it. And in the end, I had learned that it wasn't the volume of your voice that got you heard, it was whether the people around you ever intended to hear you in the first place. I never responded to that message. I never called him back. I didn't tell him where I was, and I didn't give him the satisfaction of an emotional confrontation. There was nothing left to salvage, not because there hadn't been good times, but because even the good had been held up by my effort alone. Like a woman holding the roof up with her bare hands, while the people beneath it took shelter without ever wondering what kept it from falling. And the truth was, once I stopped holding it, the whole thing collapsed exactly as it should have. On what would have been our 17th wedding anniversary, I made myself a small dinner, nothing fancy, just something warm and comforting, the kind of meal you make when you want to be gentle with yourself. I poured a glass of wine, lit a candle not for the ambience, but for the ritual of it, and sat at my modest little table, letting the quiet wrap around me like a soft blanket. That night, I didn't feel lonely. I didn't feel nostalgic. I didn't even feel vindicated. I just felt present, as if, for the first time in my life, I had no one to impress, no role to perform, and no need to twist myself into something smaller or softer to fit into someone else's limited understanding of love. I heard through a mutual friend, someone from Mark's side who had always been kind in that distant, surface-level way, that they had been talking about me less and less. Apparently, Mark had told people I'd had some kind of breakdown, some midlife crisis that made me act irrationally, and that he was giving me space until I was ready to come home. The arrogance of that assumption should have angered me, but all it did was confirm everything I already knew, that even after all this, he still couldn't comprehend the idea that I might have simply left on purpose, not because I was unstable, not because I was punishing him, but because I had finally realized I didn't need to keep living a life that had systematically hollowed me out. The divorce papers were filed and signed with barely a ripple. Mark didn't contest anything. I think, deep down, he knew that any resistance would only expose the truth he'd worked so hard to ignore. There was no dramatic final meeting, no tearful confrontation in a lawyer's office, or sudden epiphany that changed everything. There was just paperwork, notarized signatures, and a quiet courier envelope confirming the end of a life that had already died long before I walked out the door. I never went back to that house. Never stepped inside it again. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of early morning, I would imagine what it must have felt like for them the first night they sat down to dinner after realizing I was truly gone, not away, not angry, not waiting for an apology, but entirely, utterly gone. I imagined the table set for four like always, with one chair empty, the silence stretching longer between bites, the absence settling into the corners like a fog they couldn't shake. I imagined Mark trying to make small talk, trying to act as though it was just a temporary thing, while Anna stirred her drink with a spoon and refused to meet anyone's eyes, and Brian stared at his phone, pretending not to notice the way the house suddenly felt too big, too quiet, too exposed. And maybe, just maybe, Mark looked at that empty chair and finally understood what it had taken me to stay as long as I did, the exhaustion of being half-loved, the ache of performing for an audience that never clapped, the humiliation of giving and giving until there was nothing left, not even the hope that it could change. But I'll never know. And that's the point. I don't need to know. Because some endings aren't loud, aren't explosive, aren't theatrical. Some endings are just a woman walking away without a word, leaving behind a life that demanded everything and gave back only silence, and finding, on the other side, that silence can be a kind of salvation too. I never told them why I left. I never left a note or a speech or a list of sins. I didn't need to. They came home to a quiet house. They looked around for signs, explanations, clues. But there was nothing. Not a single trace of me,